a discussion of current events in the nation and around the world and how they affect the people of Indiana. Here's your moderator, Larry Lough.
Two native Hoosiers are going to Washington, presumably to straighten up the mess we have there. Otis R. Bowen, Indiana's beloved governor emeritus, has been nominated and is likely to be approved this week as head of the Health and Human Services Agency, perhaps the biggest bureaucracy in Washington. And Vice Admiral John Poindexter, also a native Hoosier, has been nominated to succeed Robert McFarland as President Reagan's National Security Advisor. With questions of expenditures of the federal budget prominent in the selection of both Bowen and Poindexter, today we're going to look at the Gramm-Rudman Amendment and what it might mean for the federal budget. Will we have a balanced budget? In fact, do we have a new government age coming? Panelists for today's Public Affairs Roundtable will be Ball State University professors Cecil Bohannon from economics, commenting on the prospects of a balanced budget, Bruce Galehood from history, who'll be talking about the defense policy and Poindexter's elevation, and John Rouse from political science, commenting on Health and Human Services impacts and Bowen's challenges. John Rouse, tell us a little bit about Doc Bowen and how a small county coroner becomes head of such a large bureaucracy in Washington.
Well, it's not easy, Larry. It's a very difficult job that he has. The agency is one that was set up in 1953. Essentially, I would say that HHS, or it used to be called HEW, Health and Education and Welfare, was set up in 1953. And since that time, I would say in a way that it was meant not to be managed, or at least managed very well. It's a very difficult agency. It has as its both as its personnel and also as its clients professionals. The doctors, for example, are the clients of HHS. But let me go into some history briefly. Between 1953 and 1979, it was indeed called the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare. And then the educational aspect was split off in 1979. The department is one that can be guided, perhaps, but it cannot be managed.
You have Doc Bowen, who's an Indiana governor, like I say, a former coroner, who in fact headed some commissions and panels for Ronald Reagan to study health care costs, Social Security. But this week after he's nominated, he suggests a plan to improve Medicare. Does Bowen have the credentials? Does he have the administrative expertise to go to Washington to begin proposing changes in federal programs and take over such a large bureaucracy?
Yes, I think so. And we should look, for example, at the two previous heads of the Department of HHS. Schweiker, for example, was the first secretary between 1981 and about 1983. And then Margaret Heckler between 83 and 85. If you look at the credentials of Senator Schweiker and also former Representative Heckler, they were basically more political types. I would say, in trying to answer your question, that indeed that Bowen is not only a physician, but he is a pragmatist. And as I said, the best thing that he can do, I think, is to guide this department, not manage the department. In terms of looking at the controversial issues that they face everything from birth control issues to the issues of course, Social Security.
But isn't the problem, in what you're saying, John, is that really, since HHS is so big and has so many things underneath its umbrella, that really the very best that the head of HHS can do is simply push this Leviathan in particular directions, as compared to completely managing it.
Yes,
that if you've got a situation, for example, some new health problem that emerges, the director of HHS can push the resources in that direction compared to alternative resources. But since it's so big, they can't really manage everything.
I don't think I can emphasize ever so much the pragmatic role that Otis Bowen played in this state between 1973 and 1981. He was not a fundamentalist, conservative doctrinaire Republican. The Republican Party that he led here in Indiana was one that responded to the nuances of the problems of Indiana. And let me emphasize that he was also a consensus politician. And being a consensus politician, having to deal with these kinds of issues, for example, birth control, abortion, rights of the disabled, regulation of drugs, that would involve the Food and Drug Administration, that is under HHS, healthcare costs. In 1935, Social Security was established. In 1965, you had the establishment of Medicare and Medicaid, the Public Health Service. In the 1970s, you had the establishment of the Center for Disease Control, and of course that particular agency is dealing with the controversy involving the AIDS. Of course, there's NIH, which is the National Institutes of Health, and that focuses upon the development of a new program to try to cure cancer. Now, that is a real mouthful. That is a real broad array of programs that have to be guided, I would say, not managed.
And then what you say is basically a political moderate like Bowen that's flexible and can react to a lot of different circumstances and good at conciliating people. Probably not a bad person for the job.
Yeah, now
probably a good choice on his part.
And the thing we try to focus on this program is the Hoosier connection. And I think his Hoosier background in politics here will serve him well as he goes to Washington, D.C.
John Poindexter certainly is no household name like Otis Bowen, but he's certainly going to be in a key position as National Security Advisor. Bruce Gilhood, what do we know about him?
We know very little about him as things turn out, except that he was a deputy to Mr. McFarland, the gentleman who resigned as National Security Advisor last week. We know that he is we've used the word consensus pragmatist before. We know that essentially that's going to be his role, or at least the way he sees it, within the National Security Council. He's going to be the person who's going to try to reconcile, formulate the opinions of state, defense, intelligence, the other areas of national security, and recommend, make a recommendation to the president based upon what he sees as a consensus in terms of the making of national security policy. I think it's important to notice here that the Reagan administration has had a situation develop where just about every other president has encountered regarding the National Security Advisor. A National Security Advisor will start out essentially in his prescribed role as the executive director of the National Security Council, which reports to the president, has a wide composition within the executive branch, the cabinet departments and so forth. But as time goes along, we see that the National Security Advisor, and we could list them almost by administration, Bundy and Rostow under Johnson, Kissinger under Nixon and Ford, Brzezinski under Carter. They become more and more operators in the foreign policy sense as opposed to simply advisors. And I think the major reason for this is that more and more government-to-government business is being transacted at the highest level. And you have presidents, perhaps starting with Johnson, perhaps starting with Kennedy, or perhaps starting with Kennedy and Johnson, who want to be more and more involved in the foreign policy making process. Nixon admitted when he went into the White House that he expected to be his own Secretary of State. Certainly Carter followed in some respects that. Now, Reagan has, I think, backed off a little bit from that approach and has put a little bit more responsibility in the hands of his Secretary of State. But nevertheless, on fundamental issues such as the summit, such as arms control and things like this, these involve the White House directly, and these involve the National Security Advisor, and this person's power tends to increase over time. And we see what has happened here with Richard Allen, Reagan's first National Security Advisor. He was essentially involved in a controversy with Alexander Haig, other people in the White House staff. McFarland apparently ran afoul of Donald Regan in spite of protests to the contrary, and this was one reason why he was felt that it was best for him to leave the administration. And now, I suspect within a certain period of time, maybe a year or two, or toward the closing months of the Reagan administration, perhaps you'll see that Poindexter himself will be accused of trying to essentially usurp some of the prerogatives in the foreign policy establishment that normally belong to the agencies themselves rather than within the White House.
Does he become more of an operative, more or a president's man, or does he, in fact, become a key figure with some of his own ideas and input?
we've talked about the origins of particular offices. John talked about the HHS, HEW transformation. Really, the responsibility of the National Security Advisor is to simply be the executive director of the National Security Council. He is to preside, or he's essentially to supervise the work of the staff, to be present at meetings of the National Security Council and present options to the president. He is not to carry out options. He is not necessarily to, or carry out decisions, let's put it that way, implement decisions. He's to be an advisor. Now, that line always, at least in terms of the recent past, that line seems to get crossed. Best example I could cite here would be the fact, well, really two in the case of Mr. McFarland. He apparently had personal access to the president. He could go and call on the president and ask for individual meetings with the president just about any time. And supposedly this bothered Donald Regan, because he would go into the Oval Office and see McFarland in there 4 or 5 times a day all by himself with the president, and he thought that as chief of staff, a lot of this should be, access to the president should come through him. Ironically, or maybe not ironically, this was also a problem with Henry Kissinger when he was National Security Advisor, and H.R. Haldeman, who jealously guarded access to Richard Nixon. And as another counter, let me just one point to get at that. Henry Kissinger was once asked, why is it that he always wanted to, when he was National Security Advisor, why did he always want to be in with the president so often? And his comment was, well, don't you understand? If I'm not in with them, somebody else is. And apparently this is what confounded Donald Regan a little bit, that McFarland was getting too much access to the president and perhaps at his expense, at Donald Regan's expense. It's also one of these awkward natures of government administration, I suppose, that the National Security Advisor is, in fact, supposed to have direct access to the president. And so there you have that as a problem, too, worked into the equation.
Well, what it says is in this day and age, whoever has access to the president has power.
That's right.
And who has access to the president isn't an appointed official on the part of the senator. It doesn't necessarily jive with the constitutional framework that was established. It has to do with these ad hoc institutions that have simply developed.
That's exactly right. And I think it's interesting that this seems to happen in the Reagan administration, despite Ronald Reagan's professed desire for cabinet government, decentralization of administration.
The relaxed presidency. Yeah.
Technically, these responsibilities should go out to the State Department for Foreign Policy, the Defense Department for Defense Policy, and indeed the National Security Advisor is this facilitator. But apparently that hasn't been the way that it's worked out.
Bruce, I think there are several kinds of comparisons. First of all, you talk about budgets. Mm-hmm. The HHS budget is approximately $348 billion a year. The defense budget is not far behind that. Also, in the last 3 years, there have been 3 national security advisors. Of course, this particular unit was set up in 1947. There has been Clark, of course, was the one who preceded McFarland, and then the first person was Allen. As we have, if we look back at Schweiker, who was the first secretary of HHS, who was kind of a doctrinaire kind of guy trying to cut programs and so forth. Allen was also a conservative person when it came to foreign policy. So if we look at both of these personalities, both in terms of Bowen and also Poindexter, we see more consensus kinds of people coming in to advise the president.
That's true, and one point that should be emphasized here in a lot of ways, and no matter that the fact that Poindexter has referred to himself as a facilitator, he's almost trying to take upon himself, at least in terms of his public statements, the same type of role that McFarland was to have served under Reagan, at least in the early days, after he took over, after you correctly stated, after William Clark. But there's something that has happened just in the recent past which makes me wonder whether or not that will in fact happen over the long term. Poindexter was one of the principal figures involved in the planning of the apprehension of the Achille Laurel hijackers. That's an operational function that he took upon himself. That happened in the White House. It happened apparently with the advice and counsel of state and defense and everything like that. But he was an operator in that sense, as was McFarland. And what we face today is that a president really needs a strong national security advisor. Now, this may not set well over at state or at defense or at the CIA or the directors of those and the secretaries of those agencies and departments. But the president needs that because often crises develop, and you simply need to have that kind of advice and somebody who can pull together the very disparate elements of the executive branch. Eisenhower, interestingly enough, was the person who made the National Security Advisor a strong figure. And this was his first National Security Advisor was Robert Cutler. The individual that really gave the office a lot of substance was Gordon Gray. But Eisenhower was so much out front and so much identified with foreign policy that the National Security Advisor was sort of a gray figure in the background. But his power was there, nevertheless. And when Kennedy took over, then you saw a McGeorge Bundy, and then later a Rostow, and then later a Kissinger-Brzezinski coming on, taking a lot of the that went with that.
Excuse me, Cecil. The question we have to ask, of course, will the president be better off with Bowen and Poindexter? I'd say definitely he's going to be better off with Bowen. The question about Poindexter is yet to be settled. Poindexter could serve the president very well coming up with the negotiations with the Soviets in a year or so in terms of the summit and so forth. I mean, you're going to have a unified program in terms of dealing with the Soviets. On the other hand, it could be a negative aspect in the sense that Poindexter will not give the president a different kind of point of view. And the problem is, if you go back and look at the Carter administration, on one hand you had the Secretary of State, Vance. On the other hand, you had Brzezinski, who was on the other side, and they continuously fought.
Yes, but that's the National Security Advisor's responsibility is not necessarily to be involved in that sort of a counterpoint sort of thing. What you had operative in the Reagan administration until very recently was McFarlane and Schultz against Weinberger. That was the policy difference right there. Now, whether you'll have that with Poindexter is something that remains to be seen, or McFarlane and Schultz against Reagan and Weinberger. And a point that should be brought out in connection with that, too, is that this is somewhat ironic, because if you remember about McFarlane's background was in the military. He was, I think he's a retired Marine colonel. And you would expect that under certain circumstances that his natural leaning might be to look more favorably on the defense interpretation of a particular issue. But he became a very close associate in a policy-making sense and advisory sense with both Schultz, and apparently had a lot of, was very well respected by Reagan and Nancy Reagan, which makes it more interesting that he's now out.
The plot thickens.
That's right.
No, I mean, it seems to me the general principle here that ensues from the discussion we're having is that anyone in a position like being head of Health and Human Services or National Security Advisor has to be the kind of person that's a conciliator for different factions and different groups in the government. And if, in fact, he takes a position that's radical or extreme one way or another, he immediately is going to be eased out by the personality conflicts that will emerge, the friction, the sparks that will fly because of his interaction with other people in the government. Doesn't this imply that the operation of government, to some measure, is independent of the actors that are there? That there is no way to have any radical shift in either foreign policy or domestic policy simply because of the nature, the complex and fragmented nature of the existing governmental institution?
Well, no, I would disagree. I think the Reagan administration's approach to foreign and defense policy is considerably different than its immediate Democratic predecessor, and certainly maybe even some of its Republicans. It's a cast of characters. I think maybe the political bureaucratic battles have historical roots. The policies, I think,
but nevertheless, a no negotiation position on, say, nuclear control, saying that the Soviet Union is an evil empire, massive defense builds up. Isn't that a situation that Ronald Reagan had to retrench from his original position? And couldn't that be traced to a large measure because radicals or people that have extreme positions like that cannot be sustained in the true political environment of Washington, D.C.?
Yes, I think that's true. I think that's true.
But see, I think the public ends up viewing this as not a change in policy, but simply bureaucratic politics. In other words,
what I'm saying is bureaucratic politics constrains the ability of the system to change.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
We see Bowen and Poindexter going into, I guess we called it a new government age in Washington, looking toward a serious look, apparently, at a balanced budget with the Gramm-Rudman Amendment. Is this, and certainly if you're head of Health and Human Services, a lot of social agencies which have come under the axe during the President's administration, Reagan's administration, certainly would be ripe for cutting, and even defense for that matter. Again, a large budget ripe for cutting. Are they going to have new challenges that their predecessors haven't
Well,
seen?
I think it's going to be interesting because the Gramm-Rudman Act mandates the federal government to make the budget reductions, as well known, and it mandates the particular areas where the budget reductions are going to be made. And it appears that President Reagan has accepted the notion that some defense cuts are going to have to occur. And his final acceptance of the amendment, what he has said is he wants to have a certain degree of discretion where he does make the defense cuts. Now, of course, Cap Weinberger and the defense establishment are screaming because of this. Nevertheless, it appears that there has been some kind of conciliation. There has been an agreement that we're at least going to try this path to see if we can get some meaningful budget reductions through regular process. My suspicion is, however, that just as any other case when government bureaucrats and government legislators make up institutions, there's going to be ways for them to get around the institutions. And my suspicion is, even though the Gramm-Rudman bill may pare some off of government spending, they're going to figure out either one, some way of getting around it, or two, a direct repeal of it within 2 years. And I think one of the ironic things is next year, I think it's going to be very interesting to see what happens, since it's an election year, seeing exactly who is going to take the blame for the cuts. And of course, that's what makes it interesting as to why the whole thing passed. The Republicans, the conservative, fiscal conservatives, were the ones that essentially have been calling for something like this for years. Mm-hmm. The Democrats knew if they got that in place, that any budget cuts that would be dictated in an election year, and they could use that, they could obtain political mileage that way by pointing to the Republicans who would have to make the cuts. So it ended up everyone was for it, and that's why the thing has gotten through.
The impetus behind the Gramm-Rudman bill and the many amendments which are now being added and taken away from it almost daily or weekly seems to be not only the deficit, but the specter of these astronomical deficits down the road.
Right.
Is there realistically, from an economical perspective here, is there any way to reduce the deficits without a tax increase?
Well, again, I suppose that depends upon how much you really want to cut. I mean, the bottom line, I think, is very simple. If you're willing to say we can have a pared-down military establishment, we can cut back troop levels across the seas, we can detain and slow down the arms buildup, and if we're also willing to say we're willing to make wholesale cuts in some major functions of the government, yes, we can obtain that. Otherwise, no. Otherwise, we're going to be talking about maybe some latitude of $50, $60 billion, mm-hmm. which isn't going to significantly dent the long-run prospects of the deficit.
And you notice also that the Gramm-Rudman bill, I think as it's presently constituted, does not touch Social Security.
Right, precisely.
Leave Social Security exempt. So,
and several other programs, as I understand, they're basically transfer kinds of programs. That are basically transfer kind of programs that are left exempt from the Gramm-Rudman. It'll be interesting to see whether or not the whole package of Gramm-Rudman, now added on with tax reform, may generate a circumstance where there is implicitly a tax increase as well as budget reductions. Mm-hmm. It's hard to see how it is government would exclusively take the entire budget deficit process and eliminate it through exclusively tax, either tax cuts, tax increases rather, or through budget cuts. My suspicion is you're going to get all three. You're going to have deficits, increased taxes, and reduced spending. Mm-hmm. In that each one of those, at least at certain margins, are going to be viable one way or another.
You seem to be skeptical, if not downright cynical, about the Gramm-Rudman Act, Cecil. I mean, is this a serious commitment on behalf of Congress? Or
well, I think that's my point. I don't think it is a serious commitment. I think it's a political game. The Republicans and Democrats are both playing political blackmail with one another. The Republicans want to be, the fiscal conservatives in general want to be able to say, I voted for a balanced budget. When you vote for Gramm-Rudman, you can say I voted for a balanced budget, and then you can blame any of the consequences on the balanced budget on someone else, on either the administration or other people in Congress one way or another. So politicians can have everything they want with something like Gramm-Rudman. I think what you have to do to really make Gramm-Rudman work would be to take it away from a legislative setting and raise it to a constitutional setting with something like a balanced budget amendment in a sort of, have it go through the state legislature, have it mandated from the state legislatures. I think it would probably be more effective. But to the extent it's simply a piece of legislation, it can be repealed or amended any time.
But, Cecil, Gramm-Rudman is the closest thing to a balanced budget amendment.
Sure.
And
I don't think it's going to hurt.
Well,
but I'm not very hopeful with respect
well, the thing that has happened is that the Democrats have said, yes, we'd like to get rid of the Defense Department, and the Republicans have said, yes, we'd like to get rid of HHS and,
right.
And all the others.
Somewhat of a generalization, but
yeah, it's down the right track.
And so
sure.
they said, well, the Republicans are saying we would like to get rid of the Roosevelt programs for the last 50 years. And so what both sides seem to overlook is the fact that government is here, it's going to stay, and the issue is how do we best manage and or guide these programs.
Well, I don't think I would, I don't think everyone in the United States would object to the elimination of particular programs. And I don't think the common weal would be particularly harmed if certain programs that HHS continually engaged in or currently engaged in were eliminated. I don't think the world would end. But I think certain political constituencies would raise enough problems for legislators and congressmen in general that practically that's not going to happen, whether you have a Gramm-Rudman or not.
One quick question here. It seems our time is getting a little short. You mentioned the scenario of some cuts and some tax increases of some kind. Some cuts on the domestic defense side and a tax increase to make the whole proposal a little more politically palatable. Exactly. What form will the tax increase take? Will
it'll be either specific excise taxes that appear to be hidden, or else it'll be increases in corporate taxes.
All right. Or
because if you look at what happened again with the tax reform package, which I think is a complementary activity to the Gramm-Rudman activity, the one that's going to get through is the one that increases corporate taxes and lowers personal taxes.
How about the oil import tax? Would that be a possibility?
That's possible. That's possible. But then again, the specter of lower oil prices might be something that would be politically nice to be able to say, well, oil prices are going down, things are looking nice.
Will Gramm-Rudman have any more or less effect on Indiana than any other state?
I wouldn't see as such. I wouldn't see as such. I think the tax reform
I would answer that question this way: as Indiana is, is a state with less taxes and less government, it would have less of an impact on us.
So if we want to get serious about balancing the budget, then we forget about the short-term legislation. We go to a constitutional amendment, and we not worry about sacred cows like Social Security and cut into that.
That's the whole problem. I don't think you could ever. I think if you tried to put up a constitutional amendment, what would happen in the constitutional amendment, the political process would somehow or other constitutionally make Social Security exempt. I think constitutionality is a better way to approach it. And again, I'm not saying I think Gramm-Rudman's bad. I think it's a noble effort in its own way. But in some sense, I am cynical of the entire political process after looking at the process of what's occurred to tax reform and also budget balancing.
Okay.
During this particular year.
All right. We're out of time. Thanks to our panelists, Bruce Galehood, Cecil Bohanna, and John Rouse. I'm Larry Lough. Thank you for being with us.
If you have comments regarding this program, please address them to John Rouse, Box 149, Muncie, Indiana, 47305. The producer for Public Affairs Roundtable is John Rouse. Associate producers are Cecil Bohannon and Bill Mosier. This program is a production of University Media Services, the Department of Political Science, and radio and television stations on the campus of Ball State University in Muncie, Indiana.